You're very welcome to this week's episode of Inclusion Dialogue. I am delighted to have Rory O'Sullivan, Dr. Rory O'Sullivan, on the podcast this week. And you can probably tell by his surname that he is from Ireland. And Rory, you're very welcome to Inclusion Dialogue this week.
Thank you, Joanne. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. And Rory, I obviously know you a couple of years, I'd say, at this point. And I know your research interests, but I think this is a great opportunity to bring those research interests to the listeners of Inclusion Dialogue and hopefully offer an alternative perspective. Can I ask firstly, I tend to ask my guests this, basically, your early career, your career to date, what made you interested in the area of inclusive education?
Okay, well, I suppose I started off... I trained as a post-primary teacher in mathematics and geography as my degree, and I graduated in the early 80s. And as with all maths teachers in the 80s, I did an extra qualification in computing, which obviously the way computing has gone is no longer particularly relevant, but in terms of what we learned back then. And in the 80s in Ireland, there was we were in the depths of quite a significant economic recession at the time, so there weren't that many jobs. And so the job I ended up getting was actually teaching computer studies and some mathematics in what was then called a secretarial college. So it actually turned out to be the first year of what we now know as further education and training in Ireland. It was, the course I was teaching on was a thing called a vocational preparation and training program. It was EU funded, and it was for people who were leaving school without a qualification. So it was a school, what would be technically called a school to work transitions program or a transitions program. And they were 1 year duration. In the 80s, there was no national certification for vocational education, or further education as we call it, in Ireland at the time. So we were using primarily UK-based qualifications such as City and Guilds and Pitman Institute, Royal Society of Arts, and so on. So I started, I was in my first college, or my first job for 5 years.
Do you mind me asking who's your student? Who was attending?
The students would have been, at that time, primarily about 17, 18-year-olds. They would have completed post-primary school. So these would have been, so the VPTP course, as we call it, Vocational Preparation and Training Program, that was in 1986. By 1989, they were being popularly known as what are post-leaving cert courses, because they were post your leaving cert being the terminal examination in upper secondary. And they were increasingly popular at the time. By the mid-90s, there was about 10,000, 12,000 people enrolled on these courses on an annual basis. The 90s became a very interesting period in Ireland in education broadly, where we started to look at a whole lot of areas. And in many cases, it was provoked by the OECD review of education in Ireland in 91, which was highly critical in a number of different areas. So there was things like, there was a green paper in education produced. There was a national forum on education, from which there was a report. There was a white paper in education in 1995. And during that period, there was a national certifying body for vocational education was established, called the National Council for Vocational Awards. And it was established in what is termed an ad hoc facility. So it had no legal basis, but it started to provide national certification across all of vocational education in Ireland.
Which is
and
key,
it also
right?
offered, and it also offered certification not only for, I was in what are called the vocational education committees, which were local education authorities for vocational education in Ireland. But in addition, you had they also ended up providing certification in the sectoral training areas, such as in hotel, catering, and tourism, in a body called CERT, who were the trainers in that space. You also had the agricultural training was taking place as well, and that started to move into that space as well. You had, in addition, you had vocational education where I worked. You had sectoral training, which I've mentioned, but in the middle there was a group providing industrial training, which was the National Industrial and Employment Authority, Industrial Training Employment Authority, a body called FOSS. And they were the largest provider of what I suppose we would call vocational training in Ireland at the time. They've since been disbanded, but at that time, they continued on their own certification track. So I was continuing in all of this. In the early 80s, I moved to a different college and I became a kind of a department head, or what is now known as an assistant principal. And I was in charge of admissions and marketing and going out and recruiting students for next year's courses and all that kind of thing. By the mid-90s, I became a deputy principal in another college, and then later principal in 2001. And during all that time, I became very interested in the area of qualifications, particularly for the idea that qualifications could give people the opportunity to better their situation, because we were dealing with a lot of students who had a variety of different difficult situations, not necessarily of their own making, but I suppose that's where it came from. So in the early 2000s, there was a piece of legislation, or sorry, in 1999, there was a piece of legislation in Ireland called the Qualifications Act, or the shortened version is the Qualifications Act, which established the national qualification structure in Ireland that we have today. And that from that came then the national framework. Yeah. And that's where the notion of pathways and progression routes and access and all those things, they all came from all of that. They all built on all of that. So during the whole 2000s, I was principal then from 2001 till I retired in 2023, January 23. And so I'm now a gentleman of leisure.
Busier than ever, Rory.
But I'm involved. I've moved into the research area. So I'm now in the School of Policy and Practice in the Institute of Education in Dublin City University, and in particular the Further Education and Training Research Centre, and where DCU have made me an adjunct professor, which was a great honour, I'd have to say.
So your career spans, you're right, and your career does span quite an unusual period in terms of policy and legislation around regarding FET. And I suppose my next question is, it's quite broad, but like, what is FET?
Right. Okay. Well, it's as I mentioned earlier on, there was different elements of it. There was the vocational element, there was the sectoral training element, then there was the industrial training element. But over time, and this has really been happening in education systems across the world, is that there is a convergence between what was the education space and the training space. It has been converging over time.
Yeah.
So, and similarly, it has been very much the case in Ireland. In further education, it could be broken down into 4 broad headings in terms of the types of services that exist, because it's a hugely diverse space. I worked in what would be called the vocational education or the vocational colleges space, which was post-secondary provision, which would be 1 or 2 year programs to prepare people for the skills to enter the labour market, or through the certification program to progress on to further study, be it in further education or in higher education or wherever else. There is also, which is in terms of the broader understanding of FET now, adult and community education, which would be for people who have perhaps a poor educational history, a poor educational experience in the past, have literacy difficulties or lower
Yep.
education difficulties, or have been away from the labour market for a number of years and need a kind of a period of, I call it a developmental phase, to bring them up to a point, bring their educational attainment up to a point where they can then move into the space I worked in, which was an pre-labour market or initial further education and training. Then you had there's a service in Ireland called Youth Reach, which would be very much parallel with the post-primary system, and it was for people who had to leave post-primary school because it wasn't working for them or whatever the case may be. But it is also considered, although it's in the post-primary years, it is also considered part of the further education and training family. So does that kind of give you a broad sense
It
in
does.
Ireland? Now, to give you an international comparison, because I know we have
Yeah.
some international listeners, what are now known as further education and training colleges, or FET colleges in Ireland, would be equivalent to community colleges in the United States or TAFE colleges in Australia, or further education colleges in the UK. Now, it's very, very hard to get an exact description because, or an exact comparison, I should say, because in many countries, further education or vocational education, if you will, is in the upper secondary track of post-primary.
Yes.
Whereas in Ireland, it's in the post-secondary space.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to get, cross-country comparisons. The like with like, there is kind of an apple with a kind of an orange kind of a comparison going on.
When you were describing the post-primary space along with the post-secondary routes,
yeah. And there
it
are
is hard.
also different labels for all of this.
Yeah.
What we call further education and training in Ireland, a label that prior to it came in the white paper that I mentioned earlier on in the mid-90s, 95. And that was where further education was first used in Ireland. And it was called further education then. It didn't become further education and training until the Qualifications Act 4 years later in 99. The further education label was in many ways borrowing the label that's been used in the UK since the post-Second World War period, which is further education. In Europe, this space is called vocational education and training, primarily. In many countries outside of Europe in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's a UNESCO term, they call it TVET, Technical and Vocational Education and Training. In Australia, it's Technical and Further Education, hence TAFE, TAFE.
Yes.
So there's lots of names, but the same fun sector.
It is a fun sector, and I teach a program to FET practitioners, as you know, a master's program here in Trinity. Yeah. And what fascinates me year on year as the different cohorts come in is that the students themselves who are FET practitioners, so they're educators or in support roles in FET, they're so different from one another, and they work in completely often different spaces, because one of them might work in Youth Reach, which is the kind of alternative education setting, whereas another might be in prison education and another might be in a post-leaving certificate college. But in many ways, their diversity is reflective of the diversity of the students that they engage with, you know? So it's possibly a good time for me to ask my next question. I know it's an area that you're hugely interested in, Rory, which is, can you talk to me about the kind of disability or special education or the inclusive education theme within FET, and what does that look like?
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't have any training in special education or inclusive education because it didn't exist when I trained in the 80s. Special education there was a term, remedial education, was used back in those days, and labels that were used back then would be considered offensive now, in some respects.
Yep.
But I suppose my interest stemmed from I'd have a very strong sense of social justice. which I got from my parents. We were raised to believe that you are no better nor worse than anyone else. Difference it's a normal part of life. If we were all the same, it'd be very boring kind of a view of the world. So I had a very strong sense of that. And as a teacher and later as a principal, and funnily enough, as a principal, I became more idealistic as a principal. People would say as you get further into your career, you become more jaded or more tired. Absolutely not. I became actually more idealistic for the simple reason that the level of administration and all of that increased over time. If you didn't hold on to your idealism, as in your reason for doing what you do, you could get distracted very easily by this noise that was out there. Like administration and governance is important and is part of our world. Of course it is. I'm not saying it's not. And particularly when you're dealing with public money, you must be transparent and all those things. But it's very easy to get distracted. So that's why I became so idealistic. So by the time I was finished, my driving, I suppose, one-liner would be everyone counts or nobody counts. If we have a society that allows anybody to be discriminated, then potentially everybody can be discriminated. So, and the notion of disadvantage, to me, I was always concerned that the debates and the discussions about disadvantage focused only on disadvantage, whereas for me, to be disadvantaged, you have to be disadvantaged relative to another group. So if we're talking about disadvantage, we should also talk about the corresponding group that's privileged in whatever search. So like you can't just, the privileged in many ways get away unnamed. And I'm including myself in a privileged group, to be honest. Yeah. So, but so there would be very much that. So where I suppose it all started was during my time as a deputy principal in the mid-90s. I began to, students with disabilities had started to come through the system, like they were coming through primary and post-primary and into the post-secondary world.
Yep.
And they were starting to move into higher education and so on and so forth. Like special education and the requirement to have special education policies and so on didn't actually occur in Irish legislation until the Education Act of 1998.
Yep.
So that placed a legal obligation on education providers, but prior to that, it was people who had an interest and had a passion for this. So I started to engage with students or members of the public who might have been wheelchair users, hearing impaired, visually impaired, and so on, and started to look at, well, first of all, how do you get in the door? How do you physically get in the door of the building? Because many of the buildings that I worked in were very old. They were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah.
And they were not built to be accessible. That is for sure. So there was those kinds of nuts and bolts, basic level stuff. And then it started then it was the curriculum itself.
Yeah.
And then it became the assessment. How do you make assessment accessible? Because if in the end, while equality is the term that's used in legislation, I believe very strongly in the concept of equity. Or put it another way, my understanding of equity is that everybody has an equal chance to succeed. Whatever you define success to be in your life, that's what we work with you to get.
Yeah.
The other thing that was happening was that admissions policies predominantly listed, if not exclusively listed, formal education requirements. So before you could come in here, you needed to have your leaving certificate or whatever phraseology it was. Also at that time, there was an increasing number of international students appearing in Ireland. So that was being added to the shall we say, the tapestry
Yeah.
of evolving student requirements. So while including people with disabilities and special needs was in many ways the starting point for my interest in inclusive provision, further education and training provision, it became a much broader concept.
Yeah.
So like when I stood up in front of, when I became a principal, I would stand up in front of teachers and we'd be talking about, our approach to teaching and learning. And, there'd be various discussions about the students having difficulty understanding. And my one line, which teachers started to quote back to me, so they must have been at least listening to what I was saying,
Exactly.
was that if the students are not learning the way we teach, then we must teach the way the students learn. Very simple, but also very difficult at times. So we started to go that way. Then there was the issue of confidentiality. So if a student started to receive learning support, you had to provide that support in as much as is possible in a way that wasn't visible or didn't identify them to the rest of the students. An example here now would be, for example, in the area of dyslexia, just to pick one. You might have a student who had a sensitivity to black text on white paper, just to pick one.
Yeah.
And then there was the different fonts. So if it was black text on white paper, we would change the paper to kind of a cream colored paper with a navy blue text or something. So, but again, that would be negotiated and discussed with the student concerned, because we knew the curricular demands of the course. And they would know their particular situation. So it became all those kinds of things. So to be honest with you, there was an element of trial and error about it.
Of course,
and we worked with students. And I love the title of your podcast, The Inclusion Dialogue, because that's what it is. It's a never-changing dialogue. Yeah. And so we experimented, we tried, we failed, we dusted ourselves off, we got back on the horse, and off we went again.
Rory, from an external, someone not working in FET perspective, the FET sector in recent years seems to have embraced the policy level, inclusion at policy level. Like FET seems to be quite progressive in acknowledging the need for, like what you're describing essentially is kind of universal approaches to education, whether it be through the curriculum or teaching and learning or whatever, and as well as the kind of physical structure, the UD space as well. Would you agree? And did that trickle down when you were principal and deputy principal? Did you see the impact of policy trickling down to practice like that? Would you see them as connected?
Yes, very much so. But to be honest with you, that really didn't start till about the mid-noughties. Because when I mentioned NCVA earlier on, but what happened then after the Qualifications Act in the further ed space, there was an organisation called FETAC, Further Education and Training Awards Council, established.
Yes, I remember
in 2001.
FETAC. Yes,
right. And that was the first time there was a single national certifying body for all further education and training, including FOSS, the industrial training, was included in this. So it was the first all-encompassing qualification. So it's what I've referred to as horizontal convergence. People came together that way.
Mm-hmm.
But and during that time, then there was the development of a whole quality assurance structure, a national structure, in terms of centre-based assessment and the quality assurance of the assessment, which in many ways paralleled the developments in higher education, although it was about 6 to 7 years behind in terms of the developmental cycle from higher education. But it was the same processes and all that. And interestingly, one of the key areas in that certification was reasonable accommodation in assessment methodology. And that was the first time that happened. And this was a state certification system.
Yeah.
All right. So that was very much the key. So we have evolved on, and then FETAC and the higher education equivalent HETAC and all the other bodies amalgamated into a single body in 2012 called QQI, or Quality and Qualifications Ireland, which is now the single qualifications and quality assurance body for further and higher education, or what is now become known as the tertiary sector.
That's right.
But during that period, they've and around the time of the financial crash, or the Great Recession, as economists call it, there was a lot of reform happened in Ireland when we were under the financial bailout. We had the IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, which were collectively known as the Troika. And I've referred to this period as the Troika years. So to be honest with you, where we are now in Ireland, we owe actually a debt of gratitude to the Troika in further ed for putting a huge amount of emphasis on it and in structures, because up to that, it was being described as the Cinderella of the Irish education system, the black sheep, the hidden sector, all of these various things. So a new body called SOLAS was established, and then we have the education and training boards. So I won't bore your listeners by getting into all that kind of detail. But suffice to say, you had all of this was part of the convergence trend, both at an organizational level, at an educational level, at a certification. Everything was converging.
Yeah.
And to answer your question in terms of the universal design in particular, one of the things that in recent years, in the mid-2010s, if I can use that term, was that SOLAS adopted the universal design for further education practitioner guidelines. So that became then the foundational principle for all further education and training. So what we were calling inclusive ed back in the 90s and the noughties is now universal design for education, or UDL. But for me as a principal, UDL in many respects was to do with the classroom and focus on the classroom. I was focusing on UDE, Universal Design Education. So it was universally designing policy, procedure, processes, the building, the services, the information we provided, the websites, the course material, everything had to be universally designed.
Yeah.
And I suppose my last job before I retired was to create the first phase of my last college, which was Cathal Brugha Fett College in Dublin city centre. We made it a universally designed Fett College.
Yeah.
So we took all the tiered seating out, and I know your higher education colleagues are going to go, what? He took out tiered seating? Yes. I returned it to a flat situation. I said, you cannot have universally designed universal design for learning unless you have a universally designed environment, learning environment. So that is what I went for. And we had freestanding furniture, and we changed it around, and we're all supposed to be teaching teamwork now. Now, I have played sports all my life, well, until recent years, till my knees decided I'd had enough. And you can teach teamwork, or you can work in teams. So I decided, as well as teaching teamwork, why not use teamwork to teach? So we changed the orientation of every classroom into a team structure. So students were put together in groups, and they could change and move and all that, but it was entirely flexible. It was a digital college, so there were no chalkboards, whiteboards, nothing. Everything was electronic, so students could access all course material in a manner, at a time, and in a place that's best suited them.
Yes.
So that was where I finished in terms of my paid employment, if you will, in that respect. But it wasn't enough to focus on just students with disabilities, or just students with special needs, or just students who had English language support. It was so much bigger. We were dealing with the Drugs Court Initiative. We were dealing with the tribunal, the educational response to victims of institutional abuse. We were dealing with, You name it, we were dealing
Everything.
with
Yeah.
everything. And in the end of the day, like I remember one student, for example, the one we had a student who came through from homeless services, and she had, in part of the City of Dublin Education and Training Board, is a foundation program aimed at people with in homeless services. And this teacher taught photography. And you might say, well, why are you teaching photography to homeless people? But it was an activity that could be done collectively. It was a structured activity because part of that at the time the idea was to reintroduce homeless people into, shall we say, some form of a structure, some form of a schedule. Now, it was obviously people could choose to be part of it. Nobody was
Of course.
coercing anybody.
Yes.
But this lady who participated in the program joined our photography course, the further education and photography course. At the end of the year, she was, student of the year, and
Wow.
6 months later she was working.
Wow.
And I'm going, that is why we do what we do.
Yeah, that's
That is the
fascinating.
power of what we do.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can never know, and this is the same in all of us in education, you can never
Yeah.
know the impact you can have on a person's life.
Yeah.
And one of the things I got rid of very fast on entry requirements was the requirement for a reference. In virtually all situations, I took it away because
Interesting.
I said, we're not about, like, in many ways, people, we all have a past, and there's nobody's past is perfect. There's parts of
No.
it none of us want to talk about, and there's part of us we're glad that it's over and all that kind of thing. So I took the view that we all have a past. We're only talking about your future.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was part of the message
Yeah.
as well. But again,
Rory,
all these things evolved over time when you met people and you saw their experience,
yes. Moving into the future, can I bring you to the future? Maybe the present first.
Okay.
But I have a couple of minutes left,
Okay.
and I'm interested in. You said you retired in 23.
Yeah.
What are your current interests, and what are you engaged with now? And I doubt they're disconnected with what we've just spoken about. But could you elaborate on what's piquing your interest at the moment?
Okay. Well, my PhD research was in skill formation policy in Ireland at
Yep.
the intermediate skill level, which would have been what further ed is. Generally speaking, 2 years post-secondary. So I was interested in not just like the what of skills of, we need more green skills, we need more of that. That's what I would consider the what of skills, but the how we do it, how do we actually develop it, is very much my area of interest. Engaging with employers to try and incentivize their involvement. But a big part of skill development program is the work practice element. People are placed as part of their course work. But if you're a person in receipt of learning support in the classroom or online, moving that learning support to a workplace environment has proven problematic. And I think that's an international difficulty and so on. So working with employers in that particular space. But through it all, so that's one area I'm looking at. The other area that I'm looking at is the area of pathways through the education system, because the route through the education system is increasingly not linear for our students. Like, we hear this phrase, continuum of education, the cradle to grave, used in the terms of lifelong learning, and that suggests a straight line. You just move on to the next thing, but that's absolutely not the case. There are pathways in multiple areas. And so the idea of developing inclusive pathways through the system, if you want the system to be inclusive, how we move from one element to the next has to be equally inclusive. The particular area that that I've spent many years working on is progression into higher education, or access to higher education for further education students.
Right.
And this is an area that's very much live in most countries. And in Ireland, we would have, I suppose, the traditional or the historically the traditional route into higher education would be through the Leaving Cert I mentioned earlier on. The it's 100 years old. It's 100 years in place. It's very academic.
Mm.
It's centrally
High
set
stakes.
exams,
Mm.
etc., etc. It's all of that. But QQI is also a state certification system. And interestingly, in 2022, the Irish government produced a policy platform towards a unified tertiary education system,
Yeah.
which basically looks at further education and higher education, or the post-secondary space, as a single sector rather than as two sectors. And I think this has been very progressive.
Yeah.
The notion of pathways develops very much from it followed from the National Framework of Qualifications, which was the Irish one was launched in 2003 and was one of the first ones in the world. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the first. And the notion of accessing one level, progressing to the next level, and so on and so forth. But in pathways, where there's more than one way to get into further education, the key to the inclusion of pathway or inclusive pathways is that they must be equally valued. And it is interestingly, that is what the current policy from the Department of Further and Higher Education states, that all pathways must be equally valued through the system. That is the area of struggle in Ireland, and I would imagine in most countries, because the first time vocational qualifications were allowed at a national level for entry to higher education was 1998. And it has been a struggle to get further and further. One simple thing, you might say, what does a unified pathway look like?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing is the pathway must exist. In further education, in higher education in Ireland, there's roughly 1,800 courses available across the entire higher education sector. From the Leaving Cert, there's 1,800 pathways. In other words, from Leaving Cert, you can access, there's a pathway into every single one of those.
Yes.
From further education, it's 86%.
Right.
So the pathway doesn't even exist to them all. And
Yes.
then you have a situation that the QQI qualification and the Leaving Cert qualification, although of the same qualification level, are not equal.
Yes.
And most especially in the inclusion space, if a student with disabilities or special needs, for example, decides to go from Leaving Cert to further education for the perfectly legitimate educational reasons or personal reasons or whatever, the supports that they would get from Leaving Cert to higher education, a system called the DARE scheme, or the Disability Access Route to Education.
Yes.
The DARE scheme is available to Leaving Cert students into higher ed, but if that student goes to further ed, they are no longer eligible to apply for it. So the DARE scheme does not exist in the further ed to higher ed pathway. So there are considerable areas of undervalue.
But is it not the case that the student that you described there would be possibly more likely to go to FET for a year in order to possibly develop or bridge the gap between their experiences in second level to third level, right?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's difficult to generalize, but you have some students, even for a confidence point of view, or some students are not 100% sure what they want to do in higher education, so they use further ed, call it a taster. Just, I want to try this out for a year as opposed to adopting them. So there's whatever people's motivations. My focus is on, is the opportunity, regardless of the route you take, equally valuable?
Yes.
Equal. And the interesting thing is, the reason I'm looking at the entire ecosystem is the choices you make at one stage, at an early stage, can have consequences for the availability of pathways later on. One particular development in recent times, there is a program in Ireland that you'll be aware of, post-junior cycle, called the Transition Year program, that happens in post-primary schools. And it is prior to people commencing the senior cycle for the Leaving Cert. So it is a 1 year where people try new things, learn new experiences, explore potential career opportunities, and is incredibly valuable.
Fantastic. Yes.
Last February, the Minister for Education announced that in the new development, there are going to be taster programs for further education in the new transition year. I said, that's a great idea. The difficulty is now, if they choose that and they are interested in FET, the pathway currently is less valuable than the. So that in itself
Yes.
has a reverse
Yes.
negative impact on the potential success. It undermines the potential for success of those taster options.
Yes.
That is my interest in. That is my interest in the pathways, is the interconnectivity of the system.
What would you like to see?
I would like to see a situation where the further education pathway and the leaving cert pathway, or all pathways, are equally valued.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not. It's a very simple thing to say. Like I understand there have to be things like benchmarking, and there have to be research done to ensure equitable transfer and all of that.
Of course.
But a lot of the arguments are still based on a structural and cultural bias against vocational qualifications in Ireland, and I understand similarly in other countries around the world.
Yeah.
But I've been fighting this particular fight for over 30 years, and I've no intentions of stopping just yet.
Rory, thank you so much. I've had such a fabulous chat, and I'll give some notes in the show notes for this podcast for the listeners as to where they can find out more information. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Joanne, and all the best.